Hi, this is Vincent Borbely for Game 372's final sprint, in which we're going over my entire game. Um, in the last video, I went over just a general gameplay loop and the critters, and in this video, I'll go over what's left of the critters, that being the Centipede and the Mushroom Field. So, let's start with the Mushroom Field. Um, in the last video, I went over mushrooms, how they work, but the grid that they're placed on, I did not. So let's talk grid. The grid is, I know it says 32 by 32, but um, columns, the 0th column and 32nd column do not show up on screen, so I believe it should still be 30 by 32. It's just my weird implementation of it. It ended up that way over time, but it should still be as intended. So the grid at its core is just an array of grid spaces in accordance with these columns and rows. A 2D array. We'll go over in a little bit what a grid space is, how I've implemented that. In addition, a grid has these variables for player area mushrooms and whether or not a critter is active. So, and player area mushrooms had a gigantic issue with it that I will talk about very soon. So, when a grid is created, it loops through basically all the columns and rows it needs to and assigns a new grid space to that point. So I feel like from this point we can't really go on without talking about what is a grid space. A grid space, it's not it's a game object, but it's not really like tangible, I would call it. It just has an occupant, a position, a pointer to the grid that owns it, and whether or not it's been visited by a flea recently. And even then, whether or not it's been visited by a flea, I'm not sure if that's necessary still. Um, so that being said, ignoring the update, since I don't know whether visited by a flea is still necessary, we have getters and setters. Um, Whether or not you activate or deactivate the occupant, which is always going to be a mushroom. So that's kind of the second level of this. The first level being handled by the grid, and we'll see that in just a second now. That's basically all the grid space is, really, is a container for a mushroom. So the grid, to continue, the grid just populates the array, or the array of grid spaces. It populates each grid space with a mushroom from the mushroom factory. Um, these numbers are uh, they're they're not they are random for the sake of this number doesn't have to specifically be 18. It's just like trying to achieve kind of purely random mushroom spawning across the grid. I'd say it's okay for what it is. And then my previously mentioned issue with player area mushrooms is whenever I would finish making the grid, the player area mushrooms would randomly spike to like above 300 million. Obviously, I don't want that because I want this flea to spawn at some point. So, how I circumnavigated this, I guess you'd say, is I had a player area mushroom counter followed by an old player area mushrooms counter. So, the player area mushrooms would be updated, and if it were updated to a value that's above 50, which ideally, I don't believe there should ever be 50 mushrooms in the player area. But if that happens, um, the player area mushrooms are instead brought back down to the level of old player area mushrooms. And there's probably a better way of fixing this issue, but this is what I came up with, and it seems to work. So let's move on. Destroying the grid is it's debatable whether this is necessary or not, given that I believe grid is not a game object, but the mushrooms are game objects. So I'm not exactly sure the order they'd be destroyed in still. In any case, it loops through the entire 2D array of grid and destroys any mushrooms that are there to destroy. Then we have setters and getters, increasing and decreasing the player area mushrooms. This is when obviously a flea is created based on the amount of player area mushrooms, so you can spawn a flea in either function. That's the only um, critter spawn that grid is really in charge of. More setters and getters, and I believe below here we just have whether or not the space is clear, whether or not the grid space is poisoned, activating and deactivating the space. I will say this is the topmost level of activation and deactivation. So, here it would call for every grid space to activate their occupant, which would call on the mushroom activation. So this is the first level that of activation, I guess you'd say, and deactivation. And regen happens below that for each mushroom. Everything that, well, the space clear and space poisoned don't need to happen for everything on the grid, but activation, deactivation, regen needs to happen for everything on the grid. So I have 4 loops for all of these. Next, I believe since that should be done. End of level mushroom regeneration. It doesn't interact with text high score manager to block anything. This is more of an attractor thing because I don't have anything on the attractor screen in general. But the centipede communicates with the grid to know how it should move and turn and whatnot. So that's what it does, as you can see. So with that being said, let's talk centipede. Now, we'll start with the spawner, as I did with the other critters. The centipede, at the start of a round or wave, it determines whether or not it should spawn going left or right. If it spawns going left, then it would spawn at column 14, and if going right, it would spawn at column 15. Then the spawner gets the length and speed necessary from the current wave and spawns an entire centipede according to those specifications. So, and this would only happen. This only happens at the start of a wave. So, this is the only time an entire centipede is going to be produced. It creates a centipede head from the centipede head factory, which is distinctly different from the centipede body factory. Pushes it to the back of a head list of active centipede heads, and for however long the centipede needs to be, it does the same, makes centipede bodies, pushes them back into an active body list for as many times as it needs to do, and when it's done, it begins playing the centipede sound, which I'll go over the sound management later. because of these head and bod lists, it's also able to destroy every centipede segment that is on the field whenever a player dies. For example, right now, centipede is destroyed and a new one is created. This even includes, say, when a split happens, these new ones are added to, or I didn't get there yet. They're added in these functions here, but nevertheless, I force a player death and the entire thing is deleted and a new centipede is spawned. So that's what Destroy Centipede does. Um, Again, setter, increase heads, increase bodies, pushes new heads and bodies to their appropriate lists. Decrease heads and bodies does what it says it does. Decrease heads specifically mean allows for a new wave to start if all the heads on screen have been destroyed, as they are eventually done through this portion here. Um, the This isn't really necessary in decreased bodies because I figure bodies can't exist without a head to guide them. So, you know. So now that we're through with Centipede Spawner, let's talk Centipede Head. Now, Centipede Head is a game object. It has a sprite and health and movement, etc. Um, you know, this after being spawned, it's initialized, um, scaled as necessary, given the appropriate column, and given the appropriate state based on how it starts. So, segue into states. Now, FSM was a long and arduous process. I'd say I understand it now, but there was a large giant issue with me having include guards when this was first implemented that really threw me for a loop. Needless to say, it works now. The centipede heads all have access to whatever movement states they should be in, and every movement state has an offset array of either ones or zeros. This is for the sake of centipede movement, because every update for a centipede head, it moves by whatever its offset should be times its speed. So when the speed is ever altered, it moves by that amount times, say, 2 or 4 or 8, etc. And the states, I'd go over them. They all more or less look like this, in which they look at the space ahead of them when it's time for them to get the next state, I should say. So, um, after enough times updating, I believe, well, it's dependent on the speed, but after it's moved however many pixels it needs to move, determined by 16 divided by its speed. And I should note also, this means that speed should be a multiple of two. It's something in the range 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. Divisible, not divisible. You get what I'm saying. In any case, so if the counter that it has built in is eventually equal to whatever it should be equal to based on its speed, then it says this isn't really necessary. This is kind of a failed thing I was working on. But it does one more movement, and it determines the new state for it to be in, which is something that its movement state actually handles inside of it. So the when the movement state gets the next state, it looks ahead wherever it should look to and says, well, if this space is clear, then continue to move right. If not, then if it's the last row, begin to turn up. If the next spot is poisoned, or otherwise, if the next spot is poisoned, then start being poisoned, start behaving poisoned. Um, Otherwise, if none of that other stuff is true and you've just hit the edge of the window, you turn down and you switch to the left. And it's more or less like this for all these different states, which was, a bit of a pain to get all of them, but they're all there. They work. I'll just let the centipede run for a second. It goes, when it turns down into a mushroom, it goes through the mushroom as it should be, I believe. And when it hits a mushroom, it turns down. When the space is deemed as unclear by the grid, it turns whichever direction downwards it needs to go in. Eventually, it would come down here, and once it hit the bottom row that I'm on right now, it would turn up. But that would take, at this rate, forever to showcase. So just take my word for it, I suppose. Let's see. When it collides with a bullet, here is another large portion. When the head collides with a bullet, if poisoned equals right. I had forgotten to showcase that. So let me just for a second go and set the first wave to wave 2 so I can have poison mushrooms. Now, I ran into an issue with the centipede because of course I did, with how it would split when being shot by a bullet. I was going to say like so, but then I missed. There. So, when being poisoned, acting in this manner, upon destroying different segments, the centipede would just absolutely freak out. So, instead, I've opted to make it so that it is just impervious to bullets while exhibiting poison behavior. Just thought I'd get that out of the way. So otherwise, its health is subtracted. It doesn't really matter. It's one shot anyway to kill it. You would spawn this. I believe all of this is just saying to spawn a mushroom ahead of the current segment and then promote the next segment of the centipede to a new head for the sake of splitting off into a new centipede. And then it would... this was again an abandoned bit of it. So this was spawning a mushroom, this was promotion of head, and this was all the other things that are necessary. Destruction and decreasing of heads, the score, the creature explosion, etc. And then some getters and setters, instructions, which is more states and directions. So what I'd like to focus on, obviously, is the promotion to head, because this was just a lot to it. The body is very similar but very different in that it moves. It doesn't use FSM like Centipede head does. It gets the same instructions. Let me go back a second. When the Centipede head is updated, it sets the instructions of the next segment to the last state it had, which is to say that this Centipede body now would have the the last instructions of the Centipede head that it was given. So it would move, by the appropriate column and row offsets as much as necessary, and the cycle would continue. Um, Very similar. Collision with bullets would result in mushroom spawns and more splits and whatnot, changed as necessary for for the body here. Um, Set instructions for other segments that are linked to it. The juicy bit here is promote to head and refresh and maybe set state in. So when a body is promoted to a head, there's a new head just created in its exact position, set with the same instructions as this body that it's created using. And then, it depending on whether or not this body has other bodies behind it, it would continue to create new bodies behind it as necessary using refresh. Refresh serves that same general purpose of kind of just creating new bodies where the old bodies would be, and then deleting the old bodies so that the newly formed centipede is updated in the correct order. This was a whole process, and to be honest, continues to still throw me for a loop today. Splitting is fine, but I will say some scenarios it's still kind of wacky, as you may have already noticed. Like, if you play very gingerly, I suppose it would be fine, but if you happen to be shooting a centipede while it's not all in the same layer, it can be a bit wacky. Some heads can collapse into other heads and whatnot. But this is why I have the workarounds that I do, so that the game doesn't just outright break in these cases. It's still playable. That's all I'll say about it. And I actually have factories. They are derived from um they have individual factories for each type of segment, and for that matter, and I forgot to go over this, I realized, but they are derived from Centipede segment, but there may not be as much in Centipede segment as perhaps was desired. They are still derived from Centipede segment, but I put the I really just put what I needed in Centipede head and body. I didn't focus too much on segment, unfortunately. But now, with that being said, I believe that's it for Centipede and Grid. So, next we'll go over, for the next video, let's say we'll go over attractor modes and play modes. The different modes, let's also say like scoring, high scores. Otherwise, I'd say those are all successful things I went over.